Okay, great. I mean, this has been a little bit difficult to put together because obviously I'm not used to talking about myself, so to speak. I remember when I was studying architecture at the AA, and my tutor had given me my notes at the end of a crit, and he had said to me in the notes that you speak so eloquently, but you hide behind facts. And I find myself dealing with this reality again today. When preparing this, I realized that there are three entities that stand very strongly in my practice. The idea of identity. So much of my work has been about trying to find my voice, my culture in a contemporary setting. The importance of purpose is very important to me. I really believe in legacy, how I will add value to my community, to my society, and obviously as little impact to the environment. And also, I'm very interested in the idea of resource. Those who have it, those who claim it, and those who need it. Now, these are two statues. These are called Ere-Ibeji. Ere-Ibeji, I'm a Yoruba girl from Nigeria. The Yoruba people are found predominantly in Nigeria, Benin, Togo, and Sierra Leone. These are known as deities, orishas, and they are created at the birth of a set of twins. And usually your name is also associated with the circumstances of your birth. So the second-born twin is known as the younger twin because your name is Tailowo, which means go and see the world. And Kehinde, I'm a twin, I'm the second twin. My name means Kehimade, so that I can come. So I had many frustrating conversations with my twin sister because I was always telling her that I was older than her. Also, I think really important is the idea of Yoruba cosmology and the role it's played in my practice. We believe that there are two realms. They're the realms of the spirits and there's the realm of the living. The spiritual world has all the orishas, the deities, and also the ancestors, and then you have the world of the living. And also in relation to this, we have a very strong belief in the idea of three spheres of existence. We have the sphere of the living, the ancestors, and the unborn. And we live and exist in this circle. And also very important in Yoruba cosmology is the idea of the essence of transition. And no matter how much technology we have, we can't break that. The idea that nothing is permanent. So I was born in Ibadan in Nigeria, which is slightly north of Lagos. Ibadan used to be the largest city in the country. It's been overtaken by Lagos. It's known for its red roofs because of the material that was readily available, zinc, at the time of its expansion. It has the first university in Nigeria, the University of Ibadan. My father studied medicine at Ibadan, and I was born shortly after he was carrying out his residency. But we didn't stay very long in Nigeria. We left to go to the United Kingdom because he won a scholarship to specialize as a gynecologist. So this is me and my twin sister. I think we had just eaten some food because our tummies are quite swollen. But what's really interesting is we abruptly it was decided in over a weekend to go back to Nigeria because my sister suffers from sickle cell, and my parents had noticed that the weather was triggering her sickle cell. And so what happened was we got to Lagos in April of 1986. We were in my auntie's house, and all of a sudden there was a blackout. And me and my sister started screaming, and then everyone laughed and said, oh, it's NEPA, Nigeria's Electrical Power Authority. Nigeria has always, well, since the Biafran War, which happened in the early 70s, Nigeria has not had 24-hour power. But I was old enough to understand that it was different from where I was coming from. But then it also became the reality of my normal. And so I grew up in 1980s Lagos, and understanding that there is this slightly complex situation of lack of infrastructure, but the city still continues to move. And so much of my early childhood was about understanding and dealing with the nuances of this. Oh, this is showing. So this was showing a map of the population of Nigeria, but so much of my childhood was about living in buildings that came about during nationalism, where we had tropical modernism, also being in a space where you didn't have a lot of electricity, but buildings that had been designed from concrete, that were looking at shaded areas, natural light, to allow the spaces to remain comfortable. This is a building that's in Ife, but very similar to a secondary school that I went to, where you had louvered windows, deep corridors, and so much of that childhood in Lagos was based around these modernist buildings. These buildings that actually are quite timeless. And you have to remember, there wasn't necessarily a culture of maintenance. And irrespective of the time, whether it was the 80s or now, and these were images that were taken quite recently, these buildings still stand the test of time. This is the Trade Fair building, which was designed by a European architect. But I did very well in school. I excelled. I was a prefect in my secondary school. This is the headmistress, Mrs. Marinho, putting on my sports prefect badge. And you can see the building in the background. That was the junior girls' block. What's really interesting about occupying these modernist buildings, you also start to understand what doesn't work. So the louvers of these buildings opened outwards. And I remember what would happen. You would see if someone dropped something from the window at the top, it would break every single window pane all the way down. And the windows that sat on the internal corridor, which obviously didn't have the same challenge, they remained in place. But from my first year to my final year, I actually saw quite a lot of them being broken and not being fixed. And I guess that's a consciousness that, well, maybe this is one of those design decisions that wasn't useful. But the idea of modernity was very impactful, I guess, in Africa. A lot of African countries gained independence between the 1950s and the 1970s. And where you have countries being formed, or the outlines of countries formed in 1885 during the Berlin Conference, you have to imagine a lot of different cultures and ethnicities were put together without a centralized kind of identity. And I guess with tropical modernism, the birth of, or the advancement of the technology of concrete, this really became a representation of what it meant to be a nation state. And so much of that culture, is synonymous with that. This is a beautiful photograph from, unfortunately, a late photographer now, Ateo, who took this in 1979 during an election period where the Western Union head, Obafemi Awolowo, was campaigning to be president. And so we left Nigeria at a period where economically things became quite challenged. In the 80s, there was the crash of the commodity, the crash of the raw materials commodities internationally. A lot of African countries really struggled. And so what happened with a lot of the tertiary universities, you had lecturers going on strike, and so people who were in 3-year courses ended up being 5 years. And so parents with means decided to take their children out of the system so you wouldn't be affected by the delays. So this is me here in the picture. At this point, me and my twin sister were not thinking we were getting on, so she's at the other end of the picture. So leaving that, I went to Kingston University to study my first degree in architecture. And funny enough, we're in Farringdon. And I remember in my first year, we came to Farringdon to do some life drawing where everyone had to take a section of terrace and detail out the facade. But I started to understand or feel that it didn't relate with where I was coming from. I was learning architecture in a manner that was great, but what would it mean in my context? How would I find my voice? Going back home regularly on holiday, I started to see, the density of our cities being completely different. Why was Lagos like this and why was London like that? And so much of my upbringing was about trying to find my voice. We also had interesting influences of architecture. This is the Brazilian style buildings that were very common that started to come about in the mid-1800s from slaves who repatriated slaves from Brazil. The style is actually Portuguese, but coming via Brazil to Nigeria. And these tended to be very affluent members of society. They were educated. There's a famous story of a Brazilian former slave who came, and he was so wealthy that he would send his dry cleaning to London to be done. But the Lagos I grew up in was actually at a period of deprivation where we had mass infrastructure development from the 70s, and then we got the massive stall. And so much of spaces, interstitial, started to be occupied in different ways. And I guess the idea of the shared commons and city infrastructure really began to suffer. Now, relating all of these experiences as a young architect, I really enjoyed, this book, and I still refer to it very often in my practice. The idea that there is a tension that exists between the top-down narrative of modernity, city planning, and the reality of how cities should work and the diversity required within them. And I relate that also to the idea of Lagos and how Lagos has found its way of creating its own voice without the structures that are top-down. And in 2001, when Rem Koolhaas's book on the Harvard City Project came out, I really thought, wow, this is amazing. Someone has taken notice of where I'm from, first of all, and has found some idea of value behind it. It really gave me an optimism that there wasn't anything innately inappropriate about it. It was just something that needed to be understood. And I remember when I saw this picture in particular, I was so fascinated because so much of Lagos is about informality. And the irony that color, which is one of those entities that is so easy to get wrong, the yellow cabs always were consistent. And I always used to wonder, how did this happen? But I wasn't sure I really wanted to be an architect at the end of the day. I really was struggling at finishing Kingston, and I found this course at UCL, Urban Design and Development, which was looking at developing world cities, and I thought this is really for me. And on this course, I learned about Lagos from books. I spent a lot of time at SOAS's library, but we had a field trip to Jamaica, and this was the point when I started to realize that there was some value for me in this space. This gentleman lived in the downtown area of Kingston, where we were doing some studies and questionnaires with the local community. And he said to me, I have never met a full African. And so you can see here, he had written on his wall, Sister Tosin from Nigeria. And I, on this trip, actually received a lot of attention because I was the only African who was present, but it made me realize that there is an opportunity in representation. When people see people who look like them, they realize what is possible. So finishing that course, I went to the Architecture Association where I did my postgraduate. That's me in the corner with my project behind me. On finishing in 2007, Rem Koolhaas came to our end of year show. And after a lot of strawberries and champagne, I went to waffle to him. I don't really remember what I said, but he offered me a job. Irony, he didn't realize that I was not a European citizen. But he had already given me the job, so I went to Lagos and he was able to sort out my work permit for me. But I think it's brought to the foreground the reality that there is a massive passport divide. This is how I travel today with 4 passports, because I've run out of pages from being stamped and I have visas for every location that I go to. It can be exceptionally frustrating, but it hasn't ever stopped me from doing what I need to do. So I went to work at OMA, and then I had to leave abruptly, I guess towards the end of the recession. And this map, interestingly enough, shows 2009, the countries that actually their economies were growing. As you can see, Africa was doing quite well. And it was actually a very optimistic time to go back home. A lot of people who had left for school were coming back home to the country. And in a very short period, I moved back home, worked for local practice, got married, got pregnant, got separated, got divorced, all in short succession. And this is my daughter on her first day with her first hair shampoo. This is us now. And then I started my practice and starting to really come back to this idea of how to create space that was conscious of identity. This is a building that's done by Demas Woku. He won the Lifetime Achievement Golden Lion at the 18th Venice Architecture Biennale, and he was one of the first pioneers who started to think about an Africanness and mixing of laterites with concrete and looking at iconography to create structure. But it also made me think about the many different materials that we've built with. Here we have zinc that is mixed with traditional building, or going further back where we had a more traditional way of building. And people still live like this. I've seen this severally going across from Lagos to Borno for the project. Just outside of Lagos, you see these little Algerian settlements. And then starting to understand that there is some sequencing that is actually quite African. This is some research that's been done by Nana Ofusu and Bushra Mohammed looking at the courtyard house, that irrespective of the location where it is or the materials of build, the idea of creating an internal courtyard surrounded by periphery dwellings is quite consistent across West Africa. And then starting to think about the technologies of the past that were terribly advanced. These are the Ife heads, which are carbon dated to 1200 and were also constructed through the lost wax system, which was considered exceptionally advanced. It's really interesting how the first time I saw one of these was at the Smithsonian in Washington, and I was so perplexed at how accurate they were, but the irony that I actually have a friend that looks like one of these. But I had to travel to the other side of the world to see something from where I'm from. it started making me think about this idea of who decides beauty, what decides, who has the control of what we consider the aesthetic or the advanced. And the idea of ornamentation, so much of these things that have been lost in our cultures when we think about the contemporary. And so I come back to this idea of Lagos and what I found personally quite exciting about where I'm from. And in practicing here as a young woman, one of our biggest projects, the Maryland Mall, I did this at 36. In this image, there are only 3 women, 2 from my office. It was a very challenging time. But I've always been very particular about looking for nuances that I can place within of myself and culture within the work. And so much of the tessellations here were included in a project. But I think also for something like this is the idea of paradox and how you can find specific moments that stand out. Now, you would never think that you would see a series of cows walking on a yellow sand beach. In the distance, you can see ships waiting to enter the port in Lagos. And having these kind of moments that make you decide that I'm going to think about a project that frames views and create an architecture around that. So we've got this additional kind of outdoor seating space where you have beautiful frame views to the sky. And it's really nice to sit here when it's not too sunny and just look up at the heavens, which I think is great. That I think are great being a designer or an architect is thinking about the experience. It's not just about creating buildings or rooms, but what aura do you create? What aura do people who visit your space feel? Do they remember that when they leave? Is it as good as smelling, touching, tasting? What senses are invoked for them? I think that's the sign of, being a successful designer. That was for a Netflix series, but I started to realize the importance of the idea of curating the experience of space. Going back into curation, I curated this exhibition in Lagos. We occupied in a modernist building, abandoned since 1990 because of a fire, an exhibition that really helped me to start to think about what it means to be an African living in Lagos. Another massive milestone that has influenced my practice was COVID and the unfortunate situation with George Floyd, which actually was also an opportunity for the world to understand that there was diversity and creativity and to bring more voices to the table. That opened up another series of doors. There was already an interest in what was happening on the continent. Here we have Beyonce wearing a gele, which is traditional dress, Christina Middle's projects, looking at Afronauts from Namibia Space Program. And then I was very fortunate to be involved in a project where we made a series of masks for Lexus, and Janet Jackson wore one of them, which I think was totally amazing. But again, this idea of understanding identity, culture, and making sure that there are nuances where you consider respectfully people's space, how this was approached with the projects in Borno, and then obviously with Sharjah, the ability to be able to take this idea of understanding the nuances of culture and identity and being able to find ways to think about the technologies of the global south and how we can think about working better in balance with the environment. And then, like was said, I went to Harvard and I was able to develop further my interest in this idea of informal systems in markets in Lagos. And I think I want to leave us with this image, so much of Lagos is about the chaos, about the many things that don't work. But even within that, there is always order. And within that order, there's opportunity. And what can we do when we think about these parts of the world that are completely different and don't follow these standard orthodox? So much of Lagos has evolved around this system and this informal structure. I'm going to show very briefly, not the whole video, of a specialist market that comes about from this reality. Because this is my Lagos. This is how your average Nigerian is able to put together, couple, and get a car. When you think that a car, on average, a brand new car is £20,000 in a country where so many people live on less than $1 a day, where Nigeria's naira has devalued over 700% since 2005, and you don't have a country with a very advanced public transport system. People find innovative ways to exist and thrive in modernity. I'm going to just move on from this quickly. I think what's really important is the idea that the global south, and particularly Africa, is dealing with the realities of the climate crisis, and most of the damage that will happen in the world will be experienced there. There was an image before this that hasn't come up, but this image here shows you the population growth that's happening globally. And so the area that's going to suffer the most from the climate crisis is the area that is also going to have the largest amount of births, and economically is the most challenged, and dealing with the least infrastructure. And I think just to end, I think it's really important, as I think about the idea of purpose of being a practitioner, if civilization is to survive, it must live off the interests and not the capital of nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the beautiful talk.
Thank you.
And there are so many things to think about. I wanted to start with a question, asking you that I know something that scares you. What do you think it is? What do you think you replied to that question in a podcast? You might know the podcast.
I think being forgotten.
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's such a shame to pass through this and to not leave an impact. Life must have purpose. There must be purpose for why we're here.
You also mentioned in that conversation that my daughter gave me, I don't know if your daughter gave you permission to put that picture, but
she doesn't know.
She will see the video. I will send her the link. No. But you say that your daughter gave you purpose.
Yes. Yes.
Did you realize that change, or was a necessity in a way at the time?
It was a necessity. I think I've always been very hardworking, and I always wanted to be an architect, but I don't think I'd have ever set up a practice. That came from a jolt into a reality or responsibility that I don't think I was well prepared for in the way it came. But they always say also that you will never be given anything that you cannot handle. and sometimes it's best not to dwell on it when you're in the midst of dealing with challenges, because then it could be overwhelming. But in retrospect, you then realize how much you've achieved.
Mm-hmm. And continuing to that, and also because it's also the end of your presentation, you said if we think more about middle term, about purpose, about what we leave behind, we will have a better world. If we have that, would you like to? I think it's explanatory.
Well, I think I feel very strongly about where I'm from. I feel very strongly because I grew up in a Nigeria where we always believed that things outside were better, and we didn't value what we have. We sit in a very interesting place on the continent now. Africa in 2023 contributed just 3.75 to global carbon. We are urbanized, but we're not industrialized. And the irony is that so much of the waste from the global north is coming to the global south, but we are being able to take what is considered redundant and extend it to some extent infinitely. And I think there's something interesting that can be learned from Africa today, which may not be considered as desirable, but is a very stark lesson, and the reality in the circumstance that we live in very finite conditions that we don't always pay attention to as a reality.
And do you have conversation with your daughter already about those kind of values and priorities, or you let her
I think she's living in the experience of these conversations daily. So we don't speak about it specifically, but she very much understands because this is her lived experience.
Mm-hmm. You talked also about representation and how important it is to see others doing good things. Have you missed that in your career?
I think very early on, I didn't have many examples of people who looked like me, who were doing exceptionally well. So I'm very mindful of the responsibility that I also have. And I do take time out, hopefully, to very consciously give back so that I know that there's another little girl who could have been in my position or who is in my position today, or who is in the position of me then today. And to see someone that looks like you and being able to know that it's possible and you can achieve it. I consider everything as a stacking of cards. I've done my bit or I'm doing my bit, somebody else is going to see that and is going to do something else. And that's the way that you continue to progress.
And how do you make sure that you have the time for doing that? You're rushing, you're traveling, you have projects, lots of things to do.
I don't sleep very much.
You don't sleep very much?
No.
How many hours?
4.5, 5.
Oh no, you need to sleep more, please.
But I don't look bad. I'm 45, by the way.
You look younger. I lost my point. Also, because you talk about doing for others, I had to think of there was someone that helped you at some point that was made by design, the woman who led that. It was not a part of the presentation, but I think there was a good person.
Ogunfere is such an amazing person. And the world needs people who know that their contribution is to create a platform for others, and she's done such an amazing job. The show covered 14 creatives from Nigeria, different sectors, some people interior, some people product design, myself an architect, but creating that platform where our work could be seen, and then obviously the many opportunities that come from that, the ripple, is endless. But I also want to say the time I spent at OMA was also quite important. I think I learned more there than I even did in school, or should I say that all experiences are important, but it was very significant because it also opens you up to a network outside of academia. I had today a negotiation meeting for a project, quite a large project in Nigeria that was with a former OMA colleague, so, it continues to give.
Well, you had recently this Loeb fellowship. That must also be an amazing network.
Absolutely amazing. I think generally Harvard is an amazing place, and everyone spends their Loeb years differently. I spent a lot of time actually at the Divinity School as well as the business school, two sectors that as an architect, we don't really have exposure to that kind of education, but it still ties back into thought leadership. It ties back into how I think about the city and how I want to be able to contribute to where I'm from.
All right. Maybe one last one. Something that you feel already proud of, that you have achieved, done, could be personal or professionally.
This is going to sound really sad.
That I divorce, imagine you say that.
No, I think, and I say this very humbly, I don't think that if anyone had told me 20 years ago that I would sit in a place where I go to places and people would know my name by virtue of the labor of my hands, would I have ever considered it possible? And I'm just very thankful and proud to have done that with my surname.
Very nice. Tosin, we are very thankful and proud that you have been part of the night tonight, and we had you on the stage. And we will have later a roundtable discussion with all the speakers. But for now, thank you for
Thank you so much.